Does the carbohydrate-insulin model explain everything we need to know about obesity and weight loss? Or is the carbohydrate-insulin model completely dead and worthless? Or is the truth maybe somewhere in between? There's been a lot of controversy lately about this after a new perspective paper written by Kevin Hall and John Speakman was published. And they seem to claim that the carbohydrate-insulin model is dead. And even Dr. Ted Naiman, who's working with Diet Doctor and is a primary care physician in Seattle, he came out and tweeted, carbohydrate-insulin model is dead. But what does that mean? What do they mean by this? So let's get into this a little bit, because this is an important topic that needs a resolution. I'm Dr. Bret Scher, the medical director at dietdoctor.com. And as I mentioned, there was this recent perspective published as an editorial in the journal Science. And in this, Professors Hall and Speakman kind of went through why they think the carbohydrate-insulin model is dead. And as the carbohydrate-insulin model, basically as a summary, the way they summed it up, weight gain, specifically body fat gain, results from the act of insulin. So eating carbs raises insulin, which packs all the fuel and takes all the fuel, puts it into your fat cells, so your fat cells are growing, and therefore you're internally starved for fuel, so you need to eat more, and that starts this trend for weight gain triggered by insulin and carbohydrates. Well, Dr. Hall has been in charge of quite a number of studies that claim to refute this. And he talks about some of those studies in addition to some mouse studies in his paper. But here's the problem. All of his evidence that he uses to refute the carbohydrate-insulin model is really suspect science. Right? So when you're talking about mouse studies, you always have to be a little hesitant about mouse studies relating to humans from a time frame perspective and from a food quality perspective, from an ad libitum eating versus a controlled feeding. So I really question how that mouse studies apply. But then he talks about his human studies, one being a 2-week study. And as Dr. Ludwig proved in his meta-analysis and many of his articles, that a true low-carb adaptation period needs to be at least 2.5, if not 4 weeks long. So a 2-week study really doesn't get to the bottom of that. And we covered that in another video and article. And then he talks about a 4-week study, which was, of course, a non-randomized study that had its own methodological flaws. So does the evidence he used prove that carbohydrate-insulin model is dead? Well, probably not. But here's the thing. Do we have evidence, strong evidence, to say the carbohydrate-insulin model, as stated, is true and responsible for obesity? No, that we don't have either. So Dr. Ludwig has done great studies, including a 5-month study showing that resting energy expenditure goes up when eating a true low-carb diet. Okay, that makes sense. That's pretty impressive. He also has the Kevin Hall's own study, which was reported as a negative study about low carb, still showed that those eating low carb had a resting energy expenditure increase of more than 100 calories per day, which is not nothing. Just a lot less than what they expected and powered their study for. So how do we make sense of all this? Do carbohydrates and insulin matter? Absolutely. And as we're going to hear, I'm going to interview Dr. Ted Naiman in a little bit at the end of this video. And you'll understand the position of what he means when he says the carbohydrate-insulin model is dead. What he's talking about is the model of internal starvation. Because what happens when you have hyperinsulinemia and insulin resistance, your triglycerides go up, your blood sugar goes up. That's fuel in your bloodstream. I just question whether or not you can use that fuel efficiently. But the model as it exists may not explain everything. And actually, Dr. Ethan Weiss put out a great tweet as well. Do we have to believe that the cause of obesity and the treatment of obesity are exactly the same? It's sort of like the old saying, apples and berries and oatmeal didn't get us into the obesity crisis, but they might also not be the way to get us out of the obesity crisis. So when I sit down to talk to a patient or when I try and give advice, I'm not talking about the carbohydrate-insulin model, but I'm talking about a way that you can reduce your calories in a sustainable way that lowers your insulin, that helps you reduce body fat, preserve lean muscle mass, where you're not hungry, where you're not lowering your basal metabolic rate, where you're getting adequate nutrition and you're feeling well. So what is that pattern? Well, for a huge number of people, that is a low-carb diet, that reducing carbohydrates in that way works. And we have evidence to support it, and certainly we have lots of anecdotal experience to support it. It is a science-backed approach. Is it the only approach? No, it is not. How do you explain the people who eat 85% carbohydrates, 10% protein, and 5% fat, like those in the traditional Okinawa or in some of the other blue zones, and they are not obese? They do not have metabolic disease. It's clearly the carbohydrate insulin model doesn't explain everything, but they live lifestyles where they are insulin sensitive, where they are active, where they're out in the sun. They don't overeat calories. They eat maybe twice a day. They eat until they're 70% full. They have so much different lifestyle. But when you already start off obese and you already start off insulin resistant, you already start off with chronic hyperinsulinemia, then to think that same diet's going to work for you might be a fallacy. People are different. People's bodies are different. Their internal hormonal milieu is different. So they need different treatments. And we have to realize that. And the other part of this is talking about insulin. If you only focus on postprandial insulin rises and falls after you eat, and you're not looking at the chronic basal hyperinsulinemia, those are two different topics that's so important. Eating protein can raise your insulin a little bit, but if it's a brief rise and fall of insulin, there's no harm there. That's what it's supposed to be doing. It's when your insulin is constantly elevated and you have a chronic hyperinsulinemia, that's a completely different scenario. So again, even talking about insulin as one thing is a little short-sighted because insulin works in different ways depending on the physiology. Whether the carbohydrate insulin model is quote unquote right or not kind of doesn't matter to me. And I'm not sure it should matter to you because what matters, again, is finding a sustainable way to eat that lowers your calories, lowers your insulin, helps you lose body fat, does not reduce your resting metabolic rate, helps you maintain lean muscle mass, keeps you happy and energized, and improves your metabolic health. Now, that can involve and should involve for a lot of people reducing carbohydrates and reducing insulin. All right, so that's my take on it. I hope it helps clear it up. Now let's get to this interview with Dr. Ted Naiman to hear his take and what he means when he says the carbohydrate insulin model is dead. Well, Dr. Ted Naiman, thanks so much for joining me again. And, we have another controversial topic to discuss. Is the carbohydrate insulin model dead? And what does that mean? So, there's been a lot of attention to this after the recent paper by Professors Hall and Speakman and the rebuttal by Dr. Ludwig, and even you with a tweet saying carbohydrate insulin model is dead. So I want to open the air here and say, ask you, what does that mean to you when you say carbohydrate insulin model is dead?
Got it. Okay. Well, yeah, first of all, I have to say that the carbohydrate insulin model, to me, it was really amazing in the beginning because this was like my introduction to what you eat controlling how much you eat, which I honestly believe in very, very firmly. We've always had this conventional model where people eat too much and they don't move enough. And then, your calories in goes up and your calories out goes down. And then you get fatter. And that just never really set well with me. I didn't really buy that. So I am all in on how much you eat being downstream of what you eat. So, really what you eat determines how much you're going to eat. If you eat salmon and asparagus and I'm eating, just a slurry of sugar and oil, I'm going to end up eating way more calories than you. And so what you eat really determines how much you're going to eat. And I firmly believe that. I think that, at Diet Doctor, we're really all in on what you eat, determining how much you're going to eat. So we like anything that supports that side of the equation. Let's look at what we eat, determining how much we're going to eat. And so I love that about the carbohydrate insulin model, right? This is classic, what you eat versus how much you eat. And the carbohydrate insulin model, I liked it for a long time because it really kind of supported that and it just felt right to me. There's a lot of things about the carbohydrate insulin model that are kind of factual and based on the truth. Like glycemic excursions, for example, when you eat a bunch of refined carbs and your blood sugar shoots up really high, it really does fall afterwards. And that glycemic fall really does trigger people to be hungrier and eat more downstream. And we have studies proving this. Like we've all experienced this firsthand where, you just eat juice and toast for breakfast and 3 hours later you get hypoglycemic and you're starving and you have to eat more carbs. And every low carber has experienced that. We all know what that is. That's a real thing. We have studies that prove this, right? These glycemic rises and falls will definitely drive downstream eating behavior and hunger. And so that fits into it really nicely. We're like, oh, yeah, I can see how that works, right? Um, you eat these foods that jack up your blood sugar really high. When it falls, you get hungry and you're hungry for more carbs. And it all really makes sense. And so for the longest time, that really appealed to me. And I want to say that I love these guys. I love Gary Taubes. I love Dr. David Ludwig. I mean, I love these guys. I absolutely love it. And I also I'm such a like a diet nerd that I also kind of like the controversy and the back and forth. And it's just interesting and fascinating to me. And I really don't take any of it super personally because I don't have all the answers. Nobody has all the answers. We're all just trying to do the best we can with the information we have to like move the ball forward. Everyone wants just to know how it works and what's the best approach. And all this. So I have, mad respect for everyone in the field. I like to look at all sides. I really appreciate where the carbohydrate insulin model is coming from,
Yeah.
right?
Well, let me ask you a question. Is it true to say insulin promotes fat storage and prevents fat breakdown? Therefore, you want to lower insulin to mobilize fat stores and burn them for energy. Is that a true statement?
Um, well, okay. This is where the carbohydrate insulin model falls apart. Okay, so I think some people who support the carbohydrate insulin model don't really get insulin. They don't really understand what insulin's all about and what insulin's doing. So, what insulin is doing, okay, your whole body is just poised to break down all your tissues into energy and flood your bloodstream with energy for emergency use, right? Glucagon is like this lead foot on the accelerator where if insulin's not around, every single tissue in your body will just melt down into energy and flood your bloodstream with energy. And then if it wasn't for glucagon, I mean, if glucagon wasn't enough, you have all these other adrenal gland hormones, epinephrine, norepinephrine, cortisol. All these hormones are designed to break every tissue in your body, every stored energy down into energy, flood your bloodstream so you have tons of energy for emergency use. That's the way your body's set up. And the only thing holding that back is insulin. Like insulin's the only thing keeping your entire body from just melting down into energy and flooding your bloodstream. Look at type 1 diabetics. They don't have insulin, and every tissue in their body just breaks down as rapidly as possible. They have wide open lipolysis. They flood their bloodstream with free fatty acids and triglycerides and glucose and ketones, and every fuel is absolutely maxed out. And then you give them insulin, and that all stops. So, insulin is the only thing keeping your body from just flooding your bloodstream with energy. Like right now, you're sitting there in a fasted state, and the only reason the free fatty acids in your bloodstream are not, through the roof is because insulin is constantly detecting the fuels in your bloodstream like a thermostat, like a fuel pressure sensor. And the minute your free fatty acids go up too high from lipolysis, your insulin goes up a little bit imperceptibly and tamps that back down. So
Hmm.
you're constantly sitting there with a perfect amount of fuels in your bloodstream when you're fasted, thanks to insulin and the thermostat in your pancreas just sensing fuels. And when they go up, insulin brings them back down. So here's the problem with the carbohydrate insulin model, right? The carbohydrate insulin model says that you eat carbs and that raises insulin and that shoves all the fuels into your fat cells. And then you're internally starving, right? And then you don't have enough energy in your bloodstream and you're hungrier. But if you look at people as you're getting, if as you're gaining weight, as you're getting fatter, um, your fuels are always higher in your bloodstream than someone who's lean, someone who's not getting fatter. Okay, so like let's say I'm gaining weight, right? I'm getting fatter. All my fat cells are expanding. There's too many fuels in my bloodstream. Insulin's going up. It's shoving the fuels into the fat cells. And then at some point, my fat cells are maximally full. They literally can't get any bigger. but I still have too much fuel in my bloodstream. And so insulin goes higher and higher and higher. Insulin's trying to drive fuels out of my bloodstream into my cells, but my cells are refusing it. My fat cells are all too full. My muscle cells are full of fat and they refuse glucose. So all my cells are refusing these fuels. And then the fuels in my bloodstream just get higher and higher and higher. That's what metabolic syndrome is. My triglycerides are too high. My free fatty acids are too high. My glucose is too high. Once my sugar gets so high because none of the cells take it, then I'm a type 2 diabetic. And so, this whole process of fattening, all the way down the line, you've actually got more fuel in your bloodstream than someone who's lean, someone who's thin, someone who's undereating, someone who's not getting fatter. At every time point in the fattening process, you have more fuels in your bloodstream than someone who's not getting fatter. You literally have more fatty acids. And we have studies that look at, humans and look at rodents, and you will always see higher fuels in the bloodstream in animals that are getting fatter than those who aren't. And so this
Yeah.
internal starvation part has never really been proven or documented, because it's not really there.
Well, so that's what's so interesting. Like you can have all these extra fuels, excess fuels, but can you use them as well? Are they, is your body able to use them for the energy you need, or does your body feel like it still needs more fuel?
Well, I don't think we've ever proven that you can't use them. And most animals that we do studies on, as they're getting fatter, uh, every fuel in every location is higher. Free fatty acids in the
Yeah.
bloodstream are higher. Fat in the
Hmm.
cell is higher. Triglycerides are higher. Glucose is higher everywhere. You can always compare an animal of any kind with a higher BMI with that of a lower one, and you'll have higher fuels of pretty much every kind everywhere. And so this internal starvation thing it's not really happening. No one's really documented it.
Well,
And
so
so
that's a good point, though. So you're talking about the internal starvation part of the carbohydrate insulin model, but
right,
which does not mean insulin is unimportant for weight gain and weight loss. And I think that's
right.
one of the assumptions that people make when someone says the carbohydrate insulin model is dead. I think the interpretation is frequently, how can this person not think carbohydrates and insulin are important for weight gain and weight loss? But that's those two things aren't saying the same thing, are they?
Not at all. And in fact, so like, if someone asked me, well, then why are people eating fatter? The reason, it really all comes down to satiety per calorie, right? So if I eat food that has amazing satiety, protein and minerals and micronutrients, but just 1 calorie, and I eat it, and I'm not hungry, I'm going to lose way more weight than someone who's just drinking like sugar, oil, slurry with 10,000 calories and zero protein and zero fiber and zero micronutrients. They're going to get horrible satiety per calorie. And so it really comes down to satiety per calorie. And refined carbs are terrible for satiety per calorie. They're absolutely terrible. So it's easy to see how someone's eating refined carbs. They have horrible satiety per calorie. You eat your cereal and your Wonder
Yep.
Bread, you're going to be starving 3 hours later. You have no satiety and a ton of calories. Those refined carbs have tons of caloric density. And so you can see how, well, your blood sugar is going up and falling. That makes you hungry. You ate something with no satiety and tons of calories. That's going to make your satiety per calorie horrible. You're just going to eat more later. And it's also spiking insulin the whole time. But you can kind of see how I can see how we got there. And I do believe that refined carbs are a big problem, but it's not from the insulin. And here's another point: refined fat. So you can take any omnivore mammal and dump refined fat on its food, and it will get fatter. We have studies proving this in rats, in mice, in monkeys, in humans, in pigs. You can literally just pour oil on any omnivore mammal's feed, and it will passively get fatter. How do you explain that with the carbohydrate insulin model? You don't. If you look at how we fatten rodents for studies, we just dump a bunch of refined fat into their food and they literally get fatter. this always works. This is not explained by the carbohydrate-insulin model. This is explained brilliantly by satiety per calorie. If I dump a bunch of oil on your food, you're going to get the same satiety you had before with a billion more calories. And satiety per calorie explains that perfectly. Satiety per calorie explains every observable phenomenon in the diet space, period.
But then there are all these people who say, but look, I reduced my carbs and I increased my fat. I'm pouring olive oil on everything. I'm cooking everything with cream and with butter and eating my ribeyes with butter wrapped in bacon, and I'm losing weight like crazy. So for me, adding that extra fat works. So how do you counter that?
I think they're not looking at protein and micronutrients. So if you literally just drank oil and increase your fat and cut back your carbs, I don't think you're going to lose anything. Like if you just took your diet and said, okay, I'm going to not eat toast and cereal and juice and bread and all the carbs, and I'm just going to add in oil. Yeah, you're literally just going to do a lateral satiety per calorie. And I would say you probably won't gain or lose anything. You'll just be absolutely the same. Like you've literally just traded refined carb for refined fat, and you're going to have a net gain of zero any way you look at it. And that interestingly, the carbohydrate insulin model would say that if you did that, you would lose a ton of weight. And I kind of don't think you will, because I think the satiety per calorie won't be improved. And we have animal studies that show this. If you isocalorically replace a refined empty calorie carb for refined empty calorie fat, everybody's still the same. That's why, we have such a fervent belief in calories in, calories out. But in reality, if you do something that improves satiety per calorie, higher protein percentage, more micronutrients, more fiber, lower energy density, all these things that we know improve satiety per calorie, you're just going to automatically eat less. And we have look at the Kevin Hall study where he, gave low carb plant-based versus high fat animal-based. In this study, the low fat plant-based group actually ate 700 calories less a day and lost more fat. And the reason was it had less than half the energy density. So the satiety per calorie was way higher because vegetables have amazing satiety per calorie. And so there are a lot of factors that change satiety per calorie that have nothing to do with insulin or with carbs. But what they have to do with is empty calories and energy density and protein percentage and all these other factors that are important.
So insulin and carbs definitely play a role in weight gain and weight loss, but they may not be the main driver. They may not be the most important thing. They have a role, as does satiety per calorie, as does energy, as does protein, as does micronutrients, as does finding a way that works for you to decrease your calories without being hungry, and without the glucose excursions. And for some people, that means avoiding carbs. For some people, that means lowering fat. But for most people, it means making sure you're getting adequate protein and adequate nutrients. Does that about sum it up?
I think that sums it up. And anytime there's a major controversy, the answer is always right down the middle somewhere. That's
All
like
right.
the cheat code.
Yeah. All right. Well, thanks, Ted. I appreciate you taking the time to help clarify the nuance that sort of needs to be discussed in this important topic. So thank you for joining me.
Oh, my pleasure. Thank you.
All right, there you have it. There's the summary from Dr. Ted Naiman. You can see his passion and his energy when he talks about this. And this concept of internal starvation when triglycerides are high and glucose is high as part of the carbohydrate insulin model is really interesting. And that he thinks that's where it sort of falls short. But again, as you can hear, he believes insulin plays a role. He believes carbohydrates play a role. So I don't think we need to be so mutually exclusive and say if the carbohydrate insulin model is quote unquote dead, then that means carbs and insulin have no role. That's not what he's saying. That's not what I'm saying. I don't think that's what anybody's saying. And even Kevin Hall noted in his paper that insulin plays a role, which is good to hear him say. So carbohydrates and insulin absolutely play a role. But let's put things into perspective. And let's think a little more broadly and nuanced about this topic. All right. Hope that was helpful. It's definitely controversial. I'm sure we're going to get some comments and some notes below. Please do so. We want to know what you think because this is controversial and we want to help people find the way to achieve healthy weight loss and metabolic health that works for them. All right. Take care, everybody. Have a great day.